please give rise to bodhicitta, the thought, I will establish all mother sentient beings at the level of perfect unsurpassable enlightenment, and to that end I will listen to this profound Dharma and put it into practice. Thus, please listen with bodhicitta. The teaching we humbly speak of today is a torch lighting the way to freedom, complete instructions on the preliminary practice of the profound and secret heart essence of the Dakini, which is comprised of 3 parts: virtuous beginning, middle, and end. Having covered the virtuous beginning, we're currently looking at the virtuous middle, the main body of the text, which itself is comprised of 2 main parts: how to follow a special friend, the route of the path, and the main explanation of the stages for setting out on the path. We have covered the first of these 2 parts and are now looking at the main explanation of the stages for setting out on the path. This itself is comprised of 2 main sections. First of all, the general preliminary practice for each session, which makes one a fit vessel. And secondly, the specific preliminary practice for the yogas of the 2 phases. So having covered the first, we're currently looking at the second, which is comprised of 2 subsections: the common preliminaries that cultivate the field of one's mind stream with the 4 practices for turning the mind, and the uncommon special preliminaries that sow the seeds of the profound path in 5 stages. We've now covered the first, the common preliminaries of the 4 mind changings, and we have arrived at the uncommon special preliminaries, the preliminary practices proper, so to speak. So we're on page 137 of the English translation now. The uncommon special preliminaries that sow the seeds of the profound path in 5 stages. First of all, taking refuge, the entrance to the path. Second, arousing the mindset on the supreme enlightenment, the root of the whole path, and so on. So we'll begin with the first, taking refuge, the entrance to the path. Taking refuge is the entrance, the gateway to all paths, and this has 2 sections. The first mentioning a few general points to be understood, and the second consisting of instructions on the points of training in this case, meaning with regards to these specific preliminaries. The former is further divided into a presentation of refuge, the entrance, and the nature and categories of faith. So we'll begin with the first, taking refuge, the entrance, and this itself has 7 parts. The reasons one needs to take refuge, and identifying the object of refuge, and so on. These 7 subdivisions. So we begin with the first. The reasons one needs to take refuge. As the Master Vimalamitra says, out of fear and mindfulness of the qualities, we go for refuge. So we've arrived at one of the most important points. So all the prior points of the 4 common preliminaries of the 4 mind changings and so on are intended to prepare us for going for refuge, so that we know how to go for refuge, so that we're fit to go for refuge. So how do we engage in the practice of taking in refuge and the other 5 uncommon preliminaries? It is by means of the 4 mind changings. Having turned our minds away from samsara by means of these reflections, these 4 reflections, it's in that way that we engage in the 5 preliminaries, beginning with refuge. Without the 4 mind changes, we could not engage in these practices. So if we were looking at the words of my perfect teacher, after the 4 mind changings would come an explanation of how to follow the teacher, but in this text, which is commentary, the explanation of how to follow a teacher begins with the explanation of how to follow a teacher. That comes before the 4 mind changings. That itself is a very excellent reasons for that presentation. So So I think Rinpoche saying the title of a text reflects its reflects its main meaning, the main content of that text, like Jimmy Rinpoche's Treasury of Precious Qualities. Treasury of Precious Qualities is a great perfection text. That's what its focus is on. That's what is at the heart of that text. But how does that text begin? It begins with an explanation of the four mind changings, because those four mind changes are crucial for the great perfection, path of the great perfection. They're crucial preliminaries for all vehicles of Buddha Dharma. So the reflection on the preciousness of the human life, impermanence and death, the shortcomings of psychic existence, and karmic cause and effect. There's no way to engage in any of the paths of Buddha Dharma without taking these to heart. And for this reason, it's these four mind changings that comprise more than half of the words of my perfect teacher, because they're so important. That said, the uncommon, special, we could say unique preliminaries for this path, the path that we are training on, are these five preliminaries that we're just beginning to discuss. The five preliminaries of refuge and so on. The four mind changings are preliminaries common to all paths of Dharma, from the Shravaka vehicle, Prachika, Buddha vehicle, Bodhisattvas, all the way up to the Vajrayana. Similarly, taking refuge is a preliminary practice, is a practice that is common to all vehicles of Buddha Dharma, from the Shravaka vehicle on up, all the way up to Tantra. So it's a common practice, a common and indispensable practice for all Buddhist practitioners. But that said, the way that refuge is taken, the way that refuge is practiced in terms of its motivation, process, objects, and so on, it does vary depending on the vehicle one's practicing. So as Atisha said, refuge is that which distinguishes Buddhists from non-Buddhists. Those who take refuge in the three jewels are Buddhists. Those who do not take refuge in the three jewels are non-Buddhists. So we need to think about this. So if you regard yourself as a Buddhist, then that is to say that you take authentic refuge in the three jewels of Buddha, Dharma and Sangha. If you want to call yourself a Buddhist, you need to take authentic refuge in those three jewels. And what we mean by that, taking refuge in the three jewels, will be explained in detail in the text from today onwards. So again, the distinction between Buddhists and non-Buddhists, we can say, is whether one takes refuge in the three jewels or not. There are other ways, indeed, there are also other ways that one can make this distinction. That is perhaps that's sort of the main point, whether one takes refuge in the three jewels or not. So what distinguishes Buddhists from non-Buddhists is whether one takes refuge in the three jewels. That which distinguishes followers of the Hinayana from the Mahayana is whether one has bodhicitta or not. That said, you can say that Buddhists and non-Buddhists can be distinguished between whether one takes refuge or not. Likewise, followers of the Hinayana and Mahayana can be distinguished by whether one has bodhicitta or not. That said, that is not the only distinction that can be made. There are some scholars who say that is sort of the one and only distinction. between Buddhist, non-Buddhist, Hinayana, Mahayana followers. However, that's probably a bit too narrow of a mindset, narrow in understanding. If we look at these distinctions with a broader mindset, we can see there are other points that distinguish Buddhists from non-Buddhists and so on, as explained by Jigme Lingpa in his Treasury of Precious Qualities. So, in terms of someone who accepts the view of the four seals, of all contingent things are impermanent and so on, qualifies as a Buddhist. One who does not is a non-Buddhist. Likewise, so Buddhists and non-Buddhists can be distinguished in terms of the view, as just explained, in terms of the path, whether one practices the 37 factors of awakening or not. Also in terms of one's conduct, and also the ultimate fruition, whether one accomplishes the state of enlightenment that transcends samsara and nirvana or not. That is also the dividing line between Buddhists and non-Buddhists. So these important points are explained by Jigme Lingpa in his Treasury of Precious Qualities. So we should be aware of these points, well aware of these important points. So we say that taking refuge or not is what distinguishes Buddhists from non-Buddhists, but if we go into it in more detail, we can say there are 5 points, 5 dividing lines that distinguish Buddhists from non-Buddhists, as explained by Jigme Lingpa. So as I've said, that is a main point, whether one takes refuge in the 3 jewels or not. That's the main point when it comes to distinguishing Buddhists from non-Buddhists, defining what it means to be a Buddhist. But we should be aware that there are other kind of aspects, other perspectives to this as well. For instance, the view that one holds, the meditation one practices, the conduct one observes, and so on. These are also, Buddhists and non-Buddhists can also be distinguished in these terms. So, taking refuge is the entranceway to the Dharma, to all paths of Dharma. So what do we mean by taking refuge? And what are the reasons one needs to take refuge? Okay, well, to backtrack and just say a bit more about Atisha's distinction between Buddhists and non-Buddhists. Atisha said that those who take genuine refuge in the 3 jewels are Buddhists, and those who do not are non-Buddhists. So, so when we say take genuine refuge in the 3 jewels, then this means being aware of what is really meant by Buddha, what is really meant by Dhamma, what is really meant by Sangha, what it really means to go for refuge, and so on, in short. But these points, these profound points, they will be understood by those who have done formal study, like the monastics and so on. But your average lay student, it's very unlikely they'll have an understanding of these things. So I think that there's debate about whether you could say then that the average person takes genuine refuge in the 3 jewels in this way. And this is all to say that, in short, this is to say that there is some debate about these various definitions and distinctions between what it means to be Buddhist and non-Buddhist. So it's good to be aware of all of these different perspectives and the different aspects of these definitions, and to have a broad mindset, a broad and open mind. So I suppose this was directed more at those who engage in formal studies, those who are learned in the scriptures and so on, and familiar with these points. So, back to the text, the reasons one needs to take refuge. The Master Vimalamicha says, out of fear and mindfulness of the qualities we go. Out of fear for the three realms of samsara, seeing that they are so dangerous and perilous, and mindful of the excellent qualities of the three jewels of the Buddha. So out of fear of samsara and mindful of the qualities of enlightenment, the enlightened kayas and wisdoms, then we go for refuge. So in this way, the essence of refuge is to go for refuge out of fear and mindfulness of the qualities of enlightenment. Without some disillusionment with samsara, some disenchantment with samsara, it's not possible that we will take refuge. And without some understanding of the qualities of enlightenment, we're also not going to take refuge. So to genuinely take refuge, we need renunciation. We need to feel renunciation for samsara, the renunciation that arises by reflecting on the four mind changings, the wish to be free of samsara, and develop an understanding that the three jewels of Buddha, Dharma and Sangha are genuine refuges. They are authentic objects of refuge. Then we will go for refuge. Then we can go for refuge authentically. Otherwise, just chanting lines of refuge, like lines of liturgy, with some nice melodies, your eyes closed, that itself does not qualify as taking refuge, as genuinely taking refuge. So, knowing that samsara is an ocean of suffering, and that the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas are endowed with wondrous qualities, inconceivable enlightened qualities, and that they are, and also knowing the advantages of being free of the lower realms and free of samsara. With that understanding, then out of fear of samsara and mindfulness of the qualities of enlightenment, we go for refuge. The reason one needs to go for refuge is that one is subject to fear. When one has nothing to fear and is free to make one's own choices and decisions, one obviously does not need to seek protection from anyone, like being a refugee. A refugee who is seeking protection, right? Seeking refuge. That's what the word refugee means. Someone who is seeking protection, seeking clothes and food and protection. So, we, since we're suffering in samsara, we seek refuge, we seek protection from those sufferings, from samsara. If we had nothing to fear and were free to make our own choices and decisions, obviously we wouldn't need to seek protection from anyone. But since time without beginning, we've been lost in the darkness of ignorance, imprisoned in the fearful dungeon that's cyclic existence. We're blinded by the darkness of ignorance. In this way, we're imprisoned in the fearful dungeon, fearful prison that is samsara. Why do we say fearful? Well, if we have to experience the intense heat and cold of the hells, the hunger and thirst of the hungry ghosts, the enslavement of animals, the birth, old age, sickness and death of humans and so on, well, that is a fearful, terrifying situation. Likewise, the conflict of demigods, the falling of gods, these are fearful states, fearful experiences. So this way, samsara is described as a fearful dungeon. We could think of the prisons of ancient Egypt, or the prisons and torture chambers of ancient Egypt, or these days of Syria, where entire generations of families are locked up in the darkness without even a toilet, and just made to disappear for decades, with not a ray of sunshine, not seeing a ray of sunshine for years and years. Some of the women being raped by the prison officers, giving birth to these children in prison. So it's that kind of suffering. It's suffering of the human realm, but it's almost like a hell realm. So these are the sufferings that human beings are subject to. So it's to be free of these sufferings, to gain freedom from these sorts of terrifying sufferings, that we take refuge in the three jewels. We're seeking protection from such suffering. This is America and England and a lot of these countries talk about having independence and human rights and so on and so forth. But then you hear about some of the prisons run by these countries, and there is certainly no independence or human rights then. So these same countries that talk about how important human rights are have created prisons, like prisons on islands off the shore of their countries, like Guantanamo Bay, I think Rimshi's referencing, where people were held and tortured in unbelievable ways, tortured with light and sound, heat and cold. Like in the blazing heat of the summer, they would add heating in the prison so that people were unbelievably hot. And in the winter, they would put the air conditioning on so that people were unbelievably cold. And in this way, torture their captives. There's no one to protect these prisoners. So they were torturing these prisoners not physically, but with sound and light and heat and cold. And most of the captives just lost their minds by the end of it. And then the countries, those imprisoning them, they remain immune to the law, because they haven't physically harmed, in the sense they haven't beaten those prisoners, so there's not a scratch or a bruise on their bodies. So these countries like the UK and the USA, they talk all about independence and human rights and honoring human rights, but it's just talk, isn't it? When you look at the things they do to other people, well, they are not honoring human rights at all. So this is torture, right? This is torture, this is torment. So the English people, British people are very smart. It's actually a very smart way to torture people, right? You cause them such intense suffering, like bring them to the threshold of death, threshold of insanity, but you remain immune to the law because you have not created a scratch or a bruise on their bodies. So British people are... Seems they're very smart and crafty like this, but maybe it's not good to say too much. There are probably some British and bunch of British or Western people here. Like Genjin Chobo, famous Genjin Chobo, he was always on spot. He said many decades ago, before all these things had happened, he said, these Western people with blue eyes and blonde hair, they pose a great danger. it's really true. He had the foresight to see that. The way the British and US have tortured people, it's the ways they've dreamt up of torturing people. Unbelievable torment they inflict upon people. So that's what Genjin Choba, even many decades ago, he said this about Westerners. These Western people with blonde hair and blue eyes, they pose a great danger. So Rinpoche is talking about different types of composition. So, in short, when it comes to composing a text, one of the most important qualities of a composition is that its meaning is immediately clear and apparent. So Genjin Choba's writings, which are very beautiful to read, have this quality. It's not like some compositions which are kind of obscure or misleading even. And Kalma Chalme's aspiration to be reborn in Sukhavati has the same qualities. It's so easy to understand, it's very beautiful and moving, but it's also really clear and easy to understand, even by those who are not very educated. So this is, anyway, a very important quality of composition, that its meaning is clear and that it's accessible and easy to understand, not cryptic or potentially misleading. So anyway, this was a tangent that came from our discussion of the fearful dungeon that's cyclic existence. Samsara is full of so much suffering, it's just like a fearful dungeon, like the prisons of ancient Egypt or Guantanamo Bay and other such prisons run by the UK and the USA. These things I learn about from listening to the BBC, so that's why I heard about those things. From this ocean of suffering, nothing except the three precious jewels is able to protect us. So it's in order to be protected from such fear that we go for refuge, keeping in mind their qualities and having the power to protect us. In order to be protected from the fear, the intense fear of the ocean of samsara, then we go for refuge in the three jewels of Buddha, Dharma and Sangha, in search of liberation from samsara and enlightenment. The omniscient state of enlightenment. And we do so keeping in mind their qualities, the enlightened qualities of body, speech, and mind, which have the power to protect us. There are three kinds of individuals who go for refuge. Beings of modest capacity take refuge as if to acquire an escort. So those who are merely afraid of the rebirth in the three lower realms and go for refuge to that end, they are of modest capacity. Then we have those who seek liberation from the whole of samsara. They are of middling capacity. And those who don't just seek liberation from samsara but seek perfect omniscient enlightenment for the sake of all beings, they are of greater capacity. So beings of modest capacity take refuge through fear of the three lower realms and with a desire to obtain the happiness of the higher realms. The family to which such individuals belong includes Buddhists and non-Buddhists, whether or not they adhere to a particular philosophical school. So such beings take refuge, but they take refuge merely with the motivation to attain rebirth in the higher realms and be free from the suffering of the lower realms. And most of us actually fall into this category. So let's give an example to illustrate this. If someone appeared right now, or Guru Rinpoche appeared right now, or Khandreshi Sogyo Mandarava, and appeared before us and took us by the hand and said, I will take you right now to Zandopari. I will take you right now to the glorious copper-colored mountain. Now, what would most of us think? Oh, I'm not ready to go. What about my spouse? What about my children? What about my house? Because we are so ensnared in attachment to this life, to samsara. Genuine practitioners who are free of this attachment would immediately be ready to go. Someone like Jiguningpa, immediately immediately they'd be ready to go. So some of you might say, oh, no, I'd be ready to go. You might claim that you'd be ready to go or that you are ready to go right here now. But if it actually happens, if and when it really came down to it, you'd probably say, oh, well, I'm ready to go. Yeah, but okay, hold on, give me a few days, Because we're attached to samsara, right? Just like Mipo Rinpoche says in his Beacon to Certainty. Oh, sorry, not that text. So, in short, Rinpoche quoted some lines that say, we are ensnared in attachment to all of the different appearances of this world, sounds, sights, and so on and so forth. And it's this confusion keeps us in samsara. So even if someone held out their hand and said, I'll take you to Guru Rinpoche's Pure Land right now, most of us would not be ready to go. That's how attached we are. Beings of middling capacity take refuge out of fear of cyclic existence and a desire to attain for themselves alone liberation in the blissful state of nirvana. These beings of middling capacity think, well, I cannot help all sentient beings, I cannot free all of them, but for myself, I wish to be free from samsara in its entirety, not just the lower realms, but the higher realms as well. So to this end, in order to free myself from samsara and attain nirvana for myself, then I practice the Dharma. I will go for refuge and practice the Dharma. And again, this is the category that most of us fall into. We are concerned with helping ourselves. We're motivated by the wish to help ourselves, to look after ourselves. We don't really have the wish, the altruistic wish to help others, to go beyond personal concerns and help others. We talk about ourselves as being practitioners of the Mahayana, those disposed with the noble disposition of the Mahayana. But when it comes down to it, we actually don't have that altruistic mindset. When it comes down to it, what sort of things do you pray for? You pray for your family, your children, your good harvest, your good luck in business. Completely dominated by personal selfish concerns. And that is not the Mahayana, that is not the mindset, altruistic mindset of the Mahayana. Beings of greater capacity take refuge because they are afraid of samsara and nirvana, and because they wish to attain the non-dwelling state beyond suffering. So in addition to fear, desire and faith, their principal motive is compassion. They belong to the family of the great vehicle. So faith essentially is liking, to like something. And there are many different types of faith, many different ways to give rise to faith, and this will be explained later on. 7 different types of faith are enumerated. Moreover, in treatises like the wish-fulfilling treasury of Longchenpa, many different types of faith are enumerated. So it's not to say that faith, it's only the Shravakas and Pratyeka Buddhas that go for refuge with faith. Of course, the Mahayana practitioners, of course, take refuge with faith, but the nature of their faith is slightly different to that of the Shravakas and Pratyeka Buddhas, or the listeners and solitary realizers. So beings of greater capacity, they take refuge because they're afraid of samsara and nirvana, and because they wish to attain the non-dwelling state beyond suffering, meaning the state that transcends samsara, the extreme of samsara, and the extreme of nirvana. And they wish to attain this state, not just for themselves, but for all sentient beings. As it's taught in Ornament of Direct Realization by Maitreya, bodhicitta is to seek enlightenment, for the benefit of sentient beings. So this is how one takes refuge as a follower of the great vehicle, or the Mahayana. One takes refuge motivated by compassion and concern for all sentient beings, all other sentient beings of all 6 classes. So we can see that refuge and bodhicitta, they're intricately connected, right? So when we're talking about refuge here, when you talk about refuge as practice in the great vehicle, you're also talking about bodhicitta. These can't be completely separated from one another. They're intimately related. So we can focus on talking about refuge, the refuge aspect. We can focus on talking about the bodhicitta aspect, but we cannot actually separate the two, right? The refuge of the greater vehicle is inseparable from bodhicitta itself. So I think it was in Pema Sadong Limpa's writings. He said, whatever practice you're doing, you need to know how to apply all vital points of practice in that single practice. If you're practicing refuge, you need to practice refuge in the way that all vital points of practice, bodhicitta all the way up, and bodhicitta and all the way up to the great perfection, are contained within that practice of taking refuge. Likewise, if you're practicing bodhicitta, if you're practicing the great perfection, for instance, if you're practicing the great perfection, you need to know, practice it in such a way that, for instance, generation and completion stages are complete in your practice of the great perfection. Then you might think, well, what does the generation stage have to do with the great perfection? Well, generation and completion stages are complete within this practice of the great perfection, and there's different types and modes of generation and completion stage practice, as explained at the different levels of Tantra, including Ati Yoga, the great perfection. So, when practicing, you need to know how to, in a single practice, embody all other practices. So I think that was taught in Pema Sodong Limpa's works. So it's helpful and important to mention these points, to introduce these points at the outset, to kind of establish a framework for one's understanding before we get into the details of specific points. So if one just goes through a text section by section without giving an overview to give the student a context, a kind of framework in which to understand all the different points discussed, it can be confusing, or it can be confusing and not so effective. So it's very effective to first of all give an overview of the subject matter. This gives one a kind of conceptual framework in which to understand and think about everything that follows in the text. So we're beginning now to talk about refuge, and for among the many divisions of refuge, we can also talk about inner, outer, and secret refuge. Refuge in the 3 jewels, but we can also take refuge in the 4 jewels, Buddha, Dharma, Sangha, and the Guru. More typically, more commonly, we talk about the 3 jewels, the three objects of refuge, namely the 3 jewels of Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. So, outer refuge is to take refuge in the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha, regarding the Buddha as the guide on the path, the teacher who guides us on the path, the Dharma as the path itself that is traversed, and the Sangha as one supports and companions on that path. So the Buddha is our teacher. He shows us the way. He shows us the way by explaining to us, oh, this is the state of enlightenment, it is like this and that. This is how you get there, this is how you practice. He guides us step by step. So we regard the Buddha as the teacher who guides us on the path. Then we regard the Dharma as the path itself, the path that we follow. The path that we follow by practicing. Mudasa Rinpoche would say there are lots of people who are engaged in practice, engaged in study, but few who actually know how to do that properly. Everything you study should be applied to oneself. It should be internalized. Everything you study, you should apply in self-reflection. Apply it to yourself and check, okay, do I have these qualities myself? Do I have these faults myself? Am I in line with the teachings or not? So as Patrul Rinpoche said, he said, you receive Dharma teachings from the teacher, but those teachings must be rooted in the authority of Buddha's own words. this is really how it is. Where do you receive teachings? You receive them from your teacher, but those teachings, they must align with Buddha's own words. The authority, the authority and valid source is Buddha's own words. So if a teacher teaches you some supposed dharma that is not in accord with Buddha's words, then it should not be taken up. So then we have the Sangha. So in the context of outer refuge, we take refuge in the Sangha as companions on the path, like travel companions. We need travel companions, right? We need friends, we need travel companions. Like if you're going to the US or traveling through the Himalayas or what have you, we need a travel companion. In the path, in places like Ngari and Tibet, and people would say, up in the Himalayas, if they'd, I think Rishi is saying if someone had travelled to Bodh Gaya in India, that would be like a badge of pride, and also competence, like I've been to Bodh Gaya, don't think I'm incompetent, I've been to Bodh Gaya, because back then it was something incredibly difficult to travel all that way. You had to travel on foot through very dangerous landscapes, foreign landscapes. There was, these days even to go to America is easy, comparatively. So, the company that we keep has an enormous effect on us. We are really strongly influenced by the company we keep, whether it be positive or negative. As it's stored in the Dodupa, an important scripture, to paraphrase, it's taught, we are influenced by our company, just like wood in the Malaya forest. There's a sandalwood forest down in South India, near where Ngondro Monastery currently is, and it's said that if just ordinary wood that grows in that sandalwood forest, it becomes infused by the scent of sandalwood. It's not actually sandalwood, but it starts to smell like sandalwood just by being close to sandalwood, right? So this is how it goes. As an ordinary people, we are very influenced by the company we keep. So if we keep bad company, then our conduct will degenerate, our views will degenerate, we'll become more unruly, start to care less for our parents, behave in negative ways. And likewise, if we keep good company, right, their own good qualities will affect us, just like the smell of saffron infusing ordinary wood. So that's why it's so important to rely on the Sangha. Positive companions. This is also why in the tantric context it's taught that one should not keep company with those who've tainted their samayas, that one should not associate with samaya transgressors. That's because we're affected by them, right, on many levels, coarse and subtle both. So if you rely on the Sangha who are endowed with excellent qualities, noble qualities, then by virtue of their example and their influence, then you'll come to embody those qualities yourself, slowly, bit by bit. So this is how we take refuge in an outer way, taking refuge in the Buddha as a guide on the path, Dharma as the path itself, and Sangha as companions on that path. So this is the common way of taking refuge. Then we have inner refuge. Inner refuge is practiced in the secret mantra, where one takes refuge in the three roots of Guru, Yidam and Dakini. So this is a type of refuge. It's unique to the Vajrayana, to the secret mantra. The Guru, the Lama, embodies all three jewels, three roots. The Buddha embodies all objects of refuge. The Guru is the nature of Buddha, the nature of Dhamma, the nature of Sangha. The Yidam, or the destined deity, is the Buddha. So the Yidam is the deity that we practice, that we pledge to practice and accomplish by means of the generation and completion stages. The generation and completion stages themselves are of many different types, like the 4 types of generation stage, completion stage with characteristics, without characteristics, completion stage of the path of skillful means, the path of liberation, and so on. So in short, the Yidam deity is that which we practice, that which we practice or accomplish. And the Dakini is like the Sangha. They are companions or supports. They support us by enacting the activities, dispelling obstacles. So these 3 roots relate to the 3 jewels. The Guru is the teacher. The Yidam is that which we practice, is the Dhamma which we practice. And the Dakini is our support. So there are so many different, so many aspects and details to these 3 roots, and to all of these points. We could talk about these points alone for 5 or 6 days. So we have Guru, Yidam, Dakini, then also the Dhamma protectors or Dhammapalas. So Dhammapalas are categorized together with the Dakini. So the Dakinis and Dhamma protectors, they both enact the activities. The activities they perform are the same, dispelling the obstacles, bestowing siddhis, and so on. So Dakinis and Dhammapalas are counted together, condensed together. So refuge in these 3 roots of Guru and Dakini is a secret refuge, secret objects of refuge. Then we have secret refuge. The secret objects of refuge are the subtle channels, winds, and essences. The subtle channels are the Namanakaya, the subtle winds are the Sambhogakaya, the subtle essences or bindus are the Dhammakaya. And these can be further subdivided in great detail. So when we talk about the subtle channels, we can talk about the central channel, the Roma and Kyangma, the right and left channels, but there are many, many more channels aside from those 3 main channels. So, So the subtle channels, when they ripen as the Namanakaya. When the subtle winds ripen, they ripen as the Sambhogakaya. And when the subtle bindus or essences ripen, they ripen as the Dhammakaya. Just as there are many different types and divisions of the subtle channels, likewise for the subtle winds, we can talk about ascending wind, descending wind, and so on and so forth. Karmic wind, wisdom wind. And when one meditates on these subtle winds, then things can really come about. For instance, heat can be generated and so on and so forth. You see all these different qualities. One becomes aware of the different qualities and aspects of the subtle winds. So at present our subtle winds are not ripe, They're not developed or ripe, but when they become developed or fully ripe, they manifest as the Sambhogakaya. Then we have the subtle essences. We could also say subtle binju, which again, there are many different types of binju, 5 types of binju, 6 types of binju, and so on and so forth. When these become fully ripened, they ripen as the Dhammakaya. So these are the secret refuge. The secret refuge are the 3 kayas, Namanakaya, Sambhogakaya, and Dhammakaya. Then we can also talk about the innermost secret refuge, which is to take refuge in the empty essence, the luminous nature, and the unimpeded capacity. Which so these innermost secret refuge objects, the empty essence, luminous nature, and so on, they are the nature of the 3 kayas, and they are taught in detail in texts like Garabdoje's 3 vital points, the purifying appearances, or Buddhahood without meditation, and so on. So if, as a practitioner, when taking refuge, one knows how to apply and condense all vital points of all practice in a single act of taking refuge, then one is a skilled, adept practitioner, as Pema Rinpoche said. Like gathering 400 streams of water into one lake or one reservoir. So this is how we need to practice. We need to know how to practice in this way, whether we're focusing on the practice of refuge or bodhicitta or vajrasattva, what have you. We need to know how to condense and apply all other important aspects of practice to that single practice. Otherwise, if you can't do that, then all your kind of practices become like diffused and scattered and ineffective, maybe we could say. In the past, so now a story to illustrate this point, the importance of knowing how to condense all practices into one. We talk about the support of scriptural quotations. So as supportive scriptural quotations, we can reference the words of Lord Atisha and so on. No one with more authority than Lord Atisha and the like. So when the teachings were translated in Tibet, they were translated in 2 periods. The first early period and later period. The greatest translator of the greatest Lotsawa of the later period was Rinchen Zampo. So this later period occurred when Lord Atisha was invited from India to Tibet. And it said that he was invited from India up through Humla, over the border into Tibet, through Purang. So So he must have, seems Lord Atisha actually must have travelled through Humla. And Rinpoche is discussing exactly which route and which kind of locations he's most likely to have travelled through. And there is evidence to support this, to support the idea that Lord Atisha travelled through Humla on his way to Tibet. So I mention this just to inspire those of us who are connected to these places. So Lord Atisha was invited from India to Tibet. He met Lotsawa Rinchen Zambo, the king of Ngondro, devoted himself to this project, so to speak, of inviting Lord Atisha and to teach in Tibet. When they asked Lord Atisha to teach, he could teach anything that was requested of him. All 5 major genres of Buddhist teachings, Pramana, Madhyamaka, Abhidhamma, and so on and so forth. His knowledge was just unimpeded. And then they said, well, can you also teach the tantras? He said, yes, I can teach the tantras, the 3 outer tantras, 3 inner tantras, and so on. And he could teach these. His knowledge in the tantras was unhindered. So sorry. Got this person mixed up there. So Atisha asked Lotso Rinchen Zampo about his knowledge, what he could teach and so on, and it was Lotso Rinchen Zampo replied that he could teach all of these, all of the teachings of Buddha, Dharma, Sutra and Tantra both. He himself was a really accomplished teacher, and then Lord Atisha responded. In response, he said, well, you yourself are so learned, such a learned and capable teacher. It seems there's no real need for me to have come to Tibet. I've come here without any real purpose. There's already teachers like you here. What can I contribute? And then Lotso Rinchen Zampo explained that actually there was definitely need and purpose for Lord Atisha to visit, because a lot of the Panditas in Tibet, they were very learned, but they were teaching their teachings in a distorted way, teaching the higher teachings at a lower level, lower teachings at a higher level. And when Lord Atisha heard about this, he said, these Panditas are rotten, these Panditas are rotten. He said that 3 times, and then he said, I see, there is a purpose, there is a reason for me being here after all. And then because a lot of teachers in Tibet, practitioners in Tibet, had started to teach the Dharma in this distorted way, then Atisha, in response, he focused primarily on teaching refuge, since it's the fundamental principle of Dharma, right? So wherever he went, he just taught refuge again and again and again, to the point where people started calling him Refuge Lama, because that's all he would teach. And when Atisha heard this, that he'd been nicknamed Refuge Lama, he was delighted. He said, nothing could be better. What is more important and precious than refuge? Sorry, I missed some points of that story, but the point is that we need to know how to condense all the vital points into the practice of refuge alone. We need to know how to condense all dharmas, all teachings and all practices into a single point. Like if some of the scholars here are expert in the Prajnaparamita teachings, they need to know how to apply those teachings to the practice of refuge, how to condense the Prajnaparamita into the practice of refuge, and so on and so forth. Kyabje Jyushu Rinpoche will say, so when it comes to taking refuge, we take refuge in the outer, inner and secret objects. We have these outer, inner and secret aspects of refuge, and we need to know how to combine all of these together, as Kyabje Jyushu Rinpoche will explain further on in the text.
야, 밥 먹지 말아. 돼지고 다만 거셔서 가을 와. 다 먹게 되면서 이게 가을 돌아가고 가을 집에 되게 그 미국이 연금 처리가 더 오스트래. 최고 지식인 집에 얘네서 딱 그래. 근데 내 미니비기 양대 이제 완전 다 송사. 유나마 숨기 때문에 인제 조시와 제가 친구들이 있잖아요. 대양을 남들 내세요.
As we read in the Lamp of the Past, we return to page 140. Know that those who strive by any means and for their own sake simply to be happy in psychic existence are beings of the lowest capacity. Those who turn their backs on happiness in psychic existence and draw away from evil deeds, who merely strive for their own peace, are known as middling beings. Those who through the suffering they've understood in themselves yearn for the complete exhaustion of all the sufferings of others, such beings are supreme. So those who go for refuge, wishing to protect all beings from the sufferings of the lower realms and free all beings from samsara, they are bodhisattva practitioners, they are followers of the greater vehicle. Such beings are supreme. Then, as Lord Atisha says, all may have the vows, excepting those who have not taken refuge. So this is very similar to lines we find in the Treasure of Abhidhamma, which say almost the same thing. And these two lines, in a very almost identical form, they appear in many texts, Treasure of Abhidhamma and also the 70 stanzas on refuge. So the 70 verses of Refuge by Lukandawa Japa, it is a really precious text that describes refuge, the refuge of the lesser vehicle, the greater vehicle, and so on, in great detail and with great clarity, but it does not, that said, it does not go into, for instance, outer inner secret and innermost secret refuge and so on. So a story about this text, 70 verses on refuge. So in the past I received the karma empowerments from Kyabji Trushu Rinpoche. And one day I went to see Trushu Rinpoche and I said, so this story is a bit like I'm praising myself, but anyway, I'm going to tell the story. If it ends up sounding like I'm praising myself, then what to do? I'm just going to tell the story as it happened. So I went to see Trushu Rinpoche one day during these karma transmissions, and I requested Rinpoche to give me the Lungan instructions for Lojin Dhamashiri's commentary on the treatise on the three vows. There are many commentaries on the three vows, like that by Khenpo Yonten Gyatso, but I had never received Lojin Dhamashiri's, and I wanted to receive the transmission and instructions both, and I'd heard that Kyabji Trushu Rinpoche had received this from Minin Chichin himself and had a very precious line of transmission for that. I thought there would be no one better to receive the transmission for this text from than from Kyabji Trushu Rinpoche, so I made this request to Trushu Rinpoche. And Rinpoche said, yeah, okay, I can give you that transmission, sure. But there are many lines of transmission for that text, actually. But But sure, as you request, I can give you that line of transmission. I think Chushumchi was saying, I'm not the only one who holds it, but sure, I can give it to you. And then he said, oh, but one special thing I can give you, and that I will give you, is the 70 verses on refuge. So one of Patrarumshi's greatest students was Tenzin Drapa. Tenzin Drapa, who was exceptionally expert in pramana. So Trishrimshi said, I will give you the transmission for the 70 verses on refuge. I have a great line of transmission for that. So just as we find here in Achisha's works, likewise in the 70 verses on taking refuge, we find these same lines, or very almost identical lines, that basically say, all may have the vows excepting those who've taken refuge. So the vows of the other Buddhist vows, such as the bodhicitta vow and so on, can be received by all who have refuge, but they cannot be received by those who have not yet taken refuge. Taking refuge is the root and basis for receiving all other Buddhist vows, all other levels of precept. So to have taken refuge means to have taken the refuge vows in a formal ceremony where you have your hair cut and recite certain lines of liturgy and so on. Of course, that qualifies as taking as refuge, but even if one has not undergone such a ritual, but nevertheless from the depth of one's heart, one has entrusted oneself to the three jewels, one has really taken refuge, sought refuge and placed one's trust in the three jewels, that also qualifies as having taken refuge. So, in other words, the refuge is the indispensable basis for all vows. Whether it be the vows of personal liberation, the inner bodhisattva vows, or the secret Vajrayana Samayas, the basis for all of these is refuge. Refuge is the indispensable basis for all other vows. So, of course, the bhikshu vows, for instance, are very important, very precious. Likewise, the secret mantra Samayas are very important and precious. But without the vows of refuge, you cannot hold that vows, you cannot receive those vows. So whichever path you are following, the path of personal liberation, the path of the bodhisattva, the path of secret mantra, the basis for all of these is first of all the receiving of refuge vows. When it comes to the practice of Vajrayana, rather than engaging in lots of ritual practice, engaging in lots of ritual practice, like an outward show of ritual practice, making tormas and performing rituals, but without really having the strength of generation and completion stage oneself. Much more beneficial than that, if one is doing practice for other people, is just to recite one mala's worth of refuge. So Buddhists and non-Buddhists are classified as such according to whether or not they've taken refuge. And without having taken refuge, there's no way one can be freed from cyclic existence. So Buddhists and non-Buddhists, the dividing line between them is whether they've taken refuge or not. But that is indeed true. But in addition, one can also distinguish Buddhists and non-Buddhists in terms of their view, meditation, conduct, fruition, and so on. And when we talk about taking refuge, then, as I've already mentioned, refuge can be taken in different ways: an outer way, inner way, secret way, innermost secret way, and each of these surpasses the other. So inner refuge is even greater than outer refuge, secret refuge even more sacred than inner refuge, and so on. So those and many other points will all be explained in more detail in the coming pages. So we'll keep going a little bit before we stop for our tea break. Identifying the object of refuge. There are two kinds of refuge objects: causal and resultant. The causal object of refuge. The causal object of refuge has two aspects, namely the refuge objects of the common vehicles and the particular refuge objects of the mantra vehicles. So we've already touched on these two different types of refuge objects. So the refuge objects of the common vehicles, these comprise worldly and supramundane objects of refuge. The former are divided into inferior objects and supreme objects of refuge. Inferior refuges include inanimate things such as mountains and fortresses, powerful non-human beings such as gods and rulers, and so on. So a lot of people take refuge in spirits and worldly spirits, in the elements, or in spirits associated with elements, spirits associated with rivers and holy trees, and so on. This is what a lot of worldly people take refuge in, right? And they love to do this. They'll have a divination done by a priest, and the priest will say, "Oh, there's some harmful forces affecting you. You must appease these by making offerings to this and that spirit which abides in this and that tree," and so on. So I also often get flooded with these sorts of requests and questions. People come to see me, students will come and say, "Oh, I feel there's some harmful force affecting me or our family, and what can we do to appease it," and so on. And I try not to kind of get invested in these conversations. I might do a divination at request and then tell people to have certain prayers done, but sometimes someone will have a divination done by two different priests. One priest will say, "Oh, there's a Zen spirit affecting you," another will say it's a Nyen spirit affecting you. Anyway, there are funny anecdotes about this. And these sorts of spirits, Nyen and Zen and so on, they can cause illness and misfortune for one, and then that sort of misfortune can be appeased by making offerings to those same spirits. So these sorts of spirits, gods, as well as rulers and like powerful kings and so on, these are all types of inferior refuges that people nevertheless take refuge in, seek protection from. So these are not authentic objects of refuge. Nevertheless, people do take refuge in them. For instance, If people wage war and then they lose, then they will surrender. They might surrender to the local king, right? And request their mercy, as this happened a lot in Tibet. Or like one area that was being attacked by another would request protection from another area, from another area's king. So we do, or people do, take refuge in this way, in these sorts of inferior refuges, but this is not a genuine refuge. Because they are such inferior objects of refuge are unable to protect us from psychic existence. Therefore they are inferior objects of refuge, for they themselves have not gained freedom from the prison of psychic existence. What does it say in the 37 practices of Bodhisattva? Since they themselves are trapped in the prison of psychic existence, worldly gods are unable to grant freedom. Since they themselves are prisoners in the prison of samsara, how can such worldly beings, worldly gods, grant freedom to fellow prisoners? That's a very loose translation of what it says in the 37 practices of Bodhisattvas. But so in this way, worldly gods and spirits and so on, they themselves are in samsara themselves, so they don't have the power to grant refuge from samsara, protection from samsara. Ram and Sita and Shiva and so on. So we should not take refuge in such gods. They are powerful gods, but they are not genuine objects of refuge, and to take refuge in them actually damages one's refuge vows. People who are fearful and afraid mostly seek refuge in mountains, forests and trees and so on. When people are fearful and afraid, they'll take refuge in everything and anything. In water, in stones, in mountains. This is a story of someone who in recent years asked a Lama for divination. The Lama said, Lama replied, "Oh, the harmful spirit affecting you is in your toilet." And then something like, there was a stone in their toilet. So they took this stone out and they washed it and anointed it with oil and made offerings to it and so on in their attempt to free themselves from these harmful spirits. Yes. Anyway, that's a funny anecdote. But in these ways, people take refuge in these sorts of inferior objects, which don't actually qualify as genuine refuge objects. Like here in Nepal, you see people make offerings to peepal trees, right? What is a genuine refuge? Genuine refuge object. It is genuine refuge is knowledge of what is correct and what is incorrect, knowing what it is that one should adopt, knowing what it is that one should reject. So Buddha said, I cannot wash away your suffering with water, I cannot sweep it away, wipe it away with my hands, but I can show you the path to freedom from suffering. So Buddha cannot just pluck our suffering away, he cannot remove our suffering from us like a surgeon removing a tumor. He cannot wash our suffering away from us. Who claims to be able to do that? Well, it's the non-Buddhists, some Hindus, for instance, who say, or Christians who claim that their gods, their mighty gods, the Almighty and so on, have the power to grant one salvation, to just pluck one out of suffering. It seems the Muslims say the same about Allah. So Buddha says, no, I cannot do this. I cannot just pluck you out of suffering. I cannot just sweep your suffering away. I cannot wash it away, like as many Hindus believe that they can wash away their sins in the Ganges River. what difficulties the Brahmins have to go through washing in the Ganges daily, even in the winter, in the freezing cold, because they believe that the water is washing away their sins. Buddha said, though, your sins cannot be washed away by water. So then you might say, but in our, in Vajrayana we have, like we do cleansing rituals with water. Yeah, but that's not just the power of water. That is, that water is first blessed with secret mantra, right? And then it's the power of mantras. The water is like a vehicle for the power of those mantras. So that's a different thing. So how then can our suffering be dispelled? How can our non-virtue be dispelled? As Buddha said, not by water, not by some powerful being, but by coming to recognize what is correct and what is incorrect. And who teaches us this? It's the Buddha that teaches us this. That's why we should regard the Buddha as our teacher, our guide. He's the one who shows us the path meaning what to do, what not to do. The Dharma then is to follow that, is that path. To follow that path. So as Buddha said, I cannot wash away your suffering with water and so on, but by showing you the natural state, I can show you the path to liberation. So these are not the best refuge, for by relying on such refuges one will not be freed from all kinds of fear. It's only by relying on the teacher and what he teaches us that we can come to free ourselves. So we take a break here and dedicate the merit.